Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship. I'm Scott Stirrett, founder and CEO of Venture for Canada, and your host. The focus of this podcast is to hear from changemakers and Canadian entrepreneurs to learn about how they've developed their entrepreneurial mindset and skills. In season 4, we'll be chatting with CEOs, founders, and successful business leaders about their career journeys. I'm excited to dive into these conversations about how to foster your entrepreneurial mindset and drive. Andrew Graham is co-founder and CEO of Borrowell, one of Canada's largest financial technology companies with 2 million users. Borrowell helps consumers find financial stability and make great decisions about their money. It was the first company in Canada to offer credit scores for free and offers products and recommendations across a consumer's financial journey. Borrowell has won numerous awards, including being named one of the top 100 fintech companies in the world by KPMG, one of the 50 fastest growing technology companies in Canada by Deloitte, and a top 50 best workplaces in Canada 2 years in a row. He was named an EY Entrepreneur of the Year for Ontario in 2019. Welcome to the program, Andrew. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great. It's great to be with you.
First, kind of starting off at the beginning of your career, one of the things I found interesting in researching your bio and that I did not know before is that you started your career in the Canadian government, serving as an aide to two Canadian cabinet ministers. So as you progressed in your career, what is a common misconception that people have about working in politics?
I think a lot of people who have not been close to government or politics can sort of lump all jobs together in government. And sometimes there's a tendency to think of those jobs as either slow or not, not as fast moving or as exciting as perhaps jobs in a startup company, for example. And my experience was really the opposite. I was really fortunate to work for two very talented cabinet ministers early in my career. And those are extremely fast moving, fast paced jobs where you have to do a lot of thinking on your feet, a lot of hard work. You're placed in a lot of situations that require quick judgments. And those are great skills that I think have served me well. To give one quick example, I was in charge in both those roles of helping brief my boss, both ministers, before question period, which is, when Parliament's sitting, that's the period of time when the opposition can ask the government questions, and you don't know what the questions are going to be in advance. All you can do is read through the news that day, try to anticipate what questions there are going to come, and then get the answers that you need as quickly as possible. And those skills, which is trying to anticipate questions, doing quick research, coming up with short to the point answers, those are super helpful to me as a CEO every day. If I'm doing an all hands, I still use some of those same skills that I was able to develop early in my career in politics.
When you're a CEO and you're doing an all hands on deck town hall with 100 plus employees, there can be a similarity to question period in the sense of that ability to respond to questions on your feet. Out of interest, who are the different cabinet ministers that you worked for?
I worked for Jane Stewart when she ran Human Resources Development Canada, as it was then called. And I worked for Eileen Carroll, who ran CEDA, the Canadian Aid Agency, when it was independent and on its own. And both were terrific, really terrific individuals to work for who were great early bosses for me and gave me a lot of latitude and frankly let me make a lot of mistakes and learn from them. So I have a lot of gratitude towards both of them.
One of the topics that we've explored a little bit on this podcast is the concept of tri-sector leadership. People have experience in government, nonprofits, and for-profit corporations. And you've worked in government. You have extensive experience as a director for several nonprofits, and you're the CEO of a for-profit tech company. To what extent do you feel that your sort of tri-sector experience helps you as an entrepreneur?
I really like the idea of tri-sector leadership and the benefits that it can convey, it can provide. So, for me, for example, I'm leading a company in the financial technology space, Borrowell, and that's a space where there's lots of regulation. So understanding what the job of regulators is, how they might think, what's going to be important to them, the dynamic between regulators and the political level. I had some exposure to all those issues in my time in government, and that's helped me for sure, as we have those kinds of conversations and think through regulatory issues. I think, my time at working with and around nonprofits, and I actually spent a bit of my career working for a nonprofit, has helped me understand, the importance of what motivates people to come work for different organizations. So, mission matters so much in the nonprofit sector. If you're going to work in the nonprofit sector, you may be taking lower comp than if you were working in the private sector, and at least in many cases. And you do that because you care a lot about the mission of the organization you're working for. At least that's sort of the typical model. And I think we've tried to carry a lot of that into our work at Borrowell. We consider ourselves a very mission-driven company. We care a lot about making the world better by helping reduce the financial stresses that afflict many people. And I think we try to really emphasize that when we hire. So even though we're a private sector employer, and we certainly pay very competitively and think a lot about comp and so forth, we also want people to choose to work for us because of the mission and because of what we're doing. And I think that those were lessons that I and others learned in the nonprofit sector.
Can you speak a little bit to the mission of Borrowell and what initially motivated you to found the company?
So our mission is to help people find more financial stability. And really what that means is we want to help people feel less stress and more confidence about achieving their financial goals. And that could be, it could be a variety of things. It could be, for many, many people, how do I get on a path so that I can buy a house or a condo in a year or two? Or how do I get on a path so that I can buy a car so I can get my family around or get a different job? Or I'm new to Canada. How do I establish credit? I mean, there's so many different financial goals we all have. And the reality is that finances are a huge source of stress. In survey after survey, when you survey people and ask them, what are sources of stress in your life? Finances are almost invariably number one, even above things like family issues, above things like health issues. People spend a lot of time worrying and stressing about their finances. And I'm sure many people listening to this podcast can relate. No matter how fortunate your situation might be, I bet there isn't a person on the planet who hasn't worried in some way about their finances from time to time. And we know those sorts of worries can have a real impact. So a leading cause of marriage breakdown and relationship breakdown is to do with finances. So what we want to do is help people by giving them the tools and the advice and the recommendations so that they can get onto a more sustainable and more confident financial path and be able to achieve whatever goals they want to achieve. We can't wave a magic wand and make everyone rich, but what we can do is, for someone who wants to understand, for example, their credit, we can provide their credit score, tell them how to improve their credit score, and at least give them the confidence to sort of take those steps to get where they want to go. And so that's always been really central to what we do. You asked, what about sort of the founding? I mean, we were the problem that animated me. I was coming from financial services, and I was shocked by how much credit card debt Canadians held. And by the way, that number's only gotten larger. It's about $100 billion of credit card debt in Canada, and much of that's held by people with very good credit histories, very good credit scores, who could probably, in many cases, be borrowing more cheaply, paying a lower interest rate. But they choose to use credit cards because credit cards are convenient. And there's a whole host of other reasons around that as well. So how can we help people make more efficient financial decisions? And how can technology play a role? It used to be that if you were wealthy, you of course could get good advice because you'd hire advisors and you'd pay them a lot and they'd give you good advice. But for everyone else, it was very hard to get good financial advice. Well, I think technology has made it possible for us to provide good advice to everybody. And that's certainly what we try to do every day at Borrowell.
It's such an important mission. And there's also a lot of studies I've read, which has been talked about the impact of financial stress on even cognitive abilities. That Andrew Yang in his book around universal basic income talks about, if somebody is paycheck to paycheck, it creates this like kind of cognitive load that actually reduces someone's ability to function and to make intelligent decisions. So financial health is something that is so important, and also that financial precariousness is linked to a whole, increased heart disease, all these other health kind of issues as well. So the mission of helping people achieve financial stability is something that's so important. I'm sure in your role, you've heard you're aware of many pieces of financial advice that are kind of commonly given to Canadians. What is one common piece of financial advice that you really disagree with?
Well, there's so many different kinds of financial advice out there. I think one piece of advice that's often given is, stay away from all forms of credit for as long as you can. And in some ways, in some situations that may be right. If you think that you can't handle any forms of credit, maybe that makes sense. But it turns out that one of the keys to establishing a strong credit score, which by the way is really essential if you want to get a mortgage and you want to access financial products like that. One aspect that's essential is having a credit history. That's what banks and other lenders look to. And so getting a low limit credit card where you're going to have, where it's going to be hard to overspend because the limit's low, starts getting you into the credit system and helps building those muscles so that you can responsibly use credit later on, number one, and number two, that you're now establishing a track record with lenders and with credit bureaus and so forth. So I think use of credit and responsible use of credit is so important. The answer isn't to run away from it. It's to sort of say, how do I do this? How do I start doing this in a way that's going to set me up for future success?
Having a credit score and using credit at the beginning of one's life or career is something that's so important. I can speak from my own personal experiences. I lived in the US and then I moved back to Canada. I had like no Canadian credit history. And then it was so challenging to do anything. It took years to kind of build that up. So I have a lot of empathy for immigrants who move to Canada and then have to establish their new credit score, but also it's a testament to, it's so important as soon as possible, I think, to begin to develop some kind of credit history. So at Borrowell, and I've followed kind of over the years, your company has diversity, equity, inclusion as a huge kind of tenet of your culture. And I know that too through different people who've worked at your company. Why do you believe that placing an emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion isn't just the right thing to do on a moral perspective, it's also the right thing to do from a business perspective?
So I think you're right. It is the right thing to do from a moral perspective. I think from a business perspective, the evidence by this point is fairly overwhelming that it provides a lot of advantages. And for anyone who is involved with recruiting today in tech, you know how challenging of a recruiting environment it is. It's so hard to find and great people, just because there's so many companies doing exciting things out there hiring. And if you're cutting your potential labor pool in half, or otherwise excluding certain groups, you're just making your life harder. So I mean, I think that's a very obvious answer. I think for those who have studied, and there's been so many studies on diversity and inclusion, as the world gets more complex and as we try to tackle more complex problems, a key aspect isn't only having smart people around the table, it's having people with diverse backgrounds and diverse experiences who can bring those to bear on a problem. So many of the challenges we deal with today at Borrowell, for example, aren't only an engineering problem. It might be a problem that has engineering aspects, that has UI, UX, sort of user interface aspects. Maybe it has financial aspects. You need sort of a business model to work. So you need people with all those different expertise to come together to help solve that problem. So if you don't have all those kinds of expertise around a table, I think you just lessen your odds of success. And that may be obvious when you're talking about skill sets. Like you never say, well, we only are going to hire finance people, or we're only going to hire software engineers to build a company. You need people with different backgrounds and different functions. I think the same is true of different backgrounds and different life experiences. And the more you can build teams with people with different backgrounds and life experiences, I think there's huge advantages that come from that.
What are some of the ways that you build a diverse recruitment pipeline of candidates?
So our talent team has done a lot of work on this, and there's I think lots of good examples to point to as well in the market. I mean, I think first of all, monitoring, you're looking at this from a numbers perspective matters a lot. So sort of saying through our hiring process across a variety of different diversity metrics, how are we doing at various steps in the funnel? I think that's a great place to start. I think for, many of us who work in tech are very quantitative. We like numbers, and being able to see how we're doing at various stages in the recruiting funnel matters, and sort of saying, is this an attraction problem? Is there something wrong with our job postings or with our company's brand that makes it that, for example, women don't want to apply here? Or is it lower down the funnel? We're getting plenty of diversity in terms of applicants, but the only people that seem to be making it through to interview are people with this very sort of homogenous background. Okay, why is that? Well, what are we selecting for? Are we asking for the right skills in the interview process? Have we trained our interviewers well enough to understand their own biases and to create a bias, as much of a bias-free process as we can? So I think being deliberate about it and tracking it and realizing that this is not just going to happen by accident because you're a bunch of well-meaning people. I think those are all really important ingredients.
Kind of going to another aspect of diversity, equity, and inclusion, how do you aim to foster an inclusive workplace?
Certainly for us, we try very hard to foster a few different values within our company. First of all, humility for us is an important value, the sense that none of us know all the answers. And a related sort of piece of that is that, team comes before individual. Like, we're all here to solve a problem, and we want to put the customer and the company first. And I think those are both good starting points. I think another sort of like cultural value is, being very upfront and saying diversity and inclusion matters, and that we will be a stronger company if we can build a more diverse and inclusive workplace, and that takes effort. So I think those are all sort of starting points. And then I think there's also a lot of tactical things you can do to help with inclusion in your workplace. However you train people to run meetings, you want to make sure that there's opportunities for everyone in the room to speak, for example. And if someone's not speaking, to try to pull them, to invite them into the conversation, to pull them into the conversation. So I think it's a combination of having values that are aligned with inclusion, and then putting in tactics in place to encourage it as well.
Yeah, it's such a complicated question, but I agree. There's the two different pieces. There's both the recruitment function, and then certainly the belongingness and kind of inclusive culture element of it. One thing I've observed both through this podcast, but also in meeting lots of entrepreneurs over the years, is entrepreneurs they're incredibly ambitious and very driven to achieve goals. And sometimes their life can become their business. And that is like the sort of sole focus of time. And there's a great book I read by Clayton Christensen, who you might have had as a Harvard Business School student, called How to Measure Your Life. And he talks about kind of this, like, not just measuring it through professional success or money or different things, but really through relationships. So kind of on this, in this vein, how do you measure your life, and how do you try to balance the sort of intense pressure running a high growth venture backed company with the overall goal of just living kind of a balanced, happy life?
I was very fortunate to have Clay as a professor of mine at HBS, and he gave a version of that lecture, which then became a book, How to Measure Your Life, I think it was the last day of class, and he would do that every year and really reflect on his own life and what had made him happy. He was obviously a huge professional success, but he was also a person of deep faith, and a person with very strong family ties. And it was very striking to see this sort of icon of business talk about some of the tough personal choices he's had to make along the way. And I think for me, if there's, the pandemic's been hard in many ways, but if there's sort of there's been a number of silver linings. One of them has been really reflecting a lot on these questions, and I've been spending a lot of time trying to be more mindful and trying to be more focused on mindfulness practice. And I think trying to remember on a day-to-day basis that, it's really hard to know what life's going to bring. And the present day, the present moment is so precious and valuable. And I've spent a lot of my life, probably too much of my life, trying to live in the future and sort of say, okay, what am I going to build next? Or if I can just accomplish this, then that'll be time to sort of relax and be happy. And I think, maybe it sounds obvious to many people, but it's been a lesson for me to learn to sort of say, that's not a good way to think. I mean, it's great to be ambitious and to want to build something and work hard, but you've got to take pleasure in the day to day. And I really try hard now to try to realize when I'm in one of those moments. So I was cooking on the weekend and was hanging out with my 2-year-old when my other 2 kids, my older kids, were with my wife. And a song came on, and I picked him up and we started dancing, and he was laughing away. And I just sort of paused to reflect and sort of say, this is kind of as good as it gets. Like this is a great moment, and whatever happened in the past, whatever happens in the future, I should be very thankful for this moment, because wow, what a terrific moment this is. Because he's going to get older, and who knows what's going to happen in our lives. And I'm trying to do more and more of that, to sort of say, boy, it is such a privilege to be able to lead a company of 140 terrific people. And whether I've come out of a hard meeting or an easy meeting, I'm in a position of great fortune and great privilege. And I should really try to enjoy this day as much as I can, because who knows if I have 10 more years of this, or who knows what's going to happen tomorrow. We can never predict those sorts of things. So certainly that sort of practice of being thankful for what I have, and trying to, as you said, nurture those important relationships, has been a big takeaway for me from the pandemic.
I love that anecdote of you cooking food with your kid and kind of doing dancing, and I agree. It's those little joys in life that sometimes I think spark the most kind of enjoyment. And it's interesting that one of the goals of this podcast, which is called New Wave of Entrepreneurship, is to try to redefine like what it means to be entrepreneurial and ultimately to be impactful. And I think sometimes an issue that more so a couple of years ago, but still lingers, is the kind of Gary Vaynerchuk, like work 100 hours a week and just like focus solely on your company and sacrifice everything for success. And I think that there's still sometimes that lingering advice that a lot of young people do hear, and they see it on social media around just hustle all the time and all things. So I think that story and anecdote that you provided is really important, because a lot of, in particular, I'd say ambitious entrepreneurial people, I'd say I reflect on this in my own self, they focus so much on the future, and it creates this hamster wheel of never being happy, because they're always just trying to keep up with the Joneses or achieve that next goal. And then ultimately, once they achieve that goal, they're never happy, because they're just thinking, oh, I want to achieve the next thing.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I do want to make clear, I'm not sort of making an argument for like, hey, work 30 hours a week and sit around and spend all of your time cooking with your 2-year-old. So this isn't an argument for not working maniacally on something you care about. I think that is really important. I think the two things for me are, first of all, try to find pleasure in the moment. You talked about sort of small joys. I sort of think that's all there is. I sort of think all there is are small joys. I think we sometimes imagine that like, once I hit this milestone, then I will be happy and I'll live in a state of joy. And I just don't think that's right. I think I've lots of friends who have exited companies and have made, lots of money, and they still have good days and bad days and happy moments and unhappy moments. So I think we sometimes fool ourselves when we sort of think, if I get to this milestone, then I can be happy, or then I can spend time. So I think that's number one. And number two, relationships matter a lot. So by all means, work super hard, work 80 hours a week on your company. We all have to go through those periods. But first of all, try to take time in those 80-hour days, or 80-hour weeks rather, to be happy and sort of say, wow, what a great conversation I just had with my co-founder. I'm so fortunate to work with someone as talented as her. And then, don't do it at the expense of relationships. As much as possible, try to find some balance, so that if there's an 80-hour week, maybe you can spend a bit of time building those relationships, because study after study shows that ultimately what matters to sort of life satisfaction and happiness is the quality of your relationships.
100%. And it's interesting. I read this piece of advice where they said, investing time in fostering or maintaining and building relationships is a form of self-care. And a lot of the times people don't, I think about that. They cut time for relationships, for work, for other things, and they often neglect relationships. And it's interesting in that Clayton Christensen book, he talks so much about that. It's like being intentional and really carving out time for fostering and maintaining relationships. And I find that some of the people who I know in my life who are often like the happiest are people who are like super intentional at like, oh, I'm going to call. Even I think of my grandmother who's 90, who is luckily very healthy. She, during the pandemic, had this like big list of like 50 people. And every day she was like, oh, I'm going to call a different person on this list. And it was a way that she maintains tons of relationships with like people she know from like 60 years ago. I personally, she's been a great kind of role model for me in that way. And I think in some ways of that kind of the greatest generation, like I think that's term for the people who were born in like the 1930s, there was a huge emphasis, I think, on relationships as part of their life. And I think sometimes amongst younger people, it has at times been deprioritized, although I think the pandemic has been, to your point, it's highlighted to many people about how so much of life's happiness is tied to relations. Andrew, it has been a true pleasure speaking with you today. We've covered a really wide range of topics. Congrats on the tremendous success of Borrowell. Thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
That's it for this week's episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our social and our email list. Subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss our next episode. If you have feedback on today's episode, tweet us at Venture4Canada. That is Venture, the number 4, Canada, or email us at podcast@venture4, that's spelled FOR, Canada.ca. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. I'm Scott Stirrett, and until next time, stay safe, stay motivated, and stay grateful. A New Wave of Entrepreneurship is produced by Juanita Lee Garcia and Latifa Farah. Editing and mixing also done by Latifa Farah. Erica Ormanston is our editorial assistant. Mark Wallach and Premium Beat own the copyright and publishing rights related to the song used in this podcast. The comments and opinions, recommendations, or suggestions expressed on the podcast by the guests are not liable to Venture for Canada and belong solely to each individual. Any information provided stated by our guests and our host is independent of Venture for Canada. A New Wave of Entrepreneurship is a Venture for Canada brand, and all content is owned by Venture for Canada. If you'd like to use our content, please reach out to us at podcast@venture4, that's spelled FOR, Canada.ca.